All right, welcome back, folks. Today we are going to do a deep dive into Zoltan Pozsar's latest article. And if you're not familiar with who Zoltan is, he wrote the book, How the Financial System Works, as well as he did work for the Fed and he worked for the U.S. Treasury. He's currently working for Credit Suisse. So he's a very credible source when it comes to talking about these sort of things. And a lot of people listen when he talks. So his article is 11 pages long. It's very detailed. It's very technical. So what I read through it a few times. And so what I want to do is I want to share that with you, but in some bite-sized pieces of the article. I'm not going to go through the entire 11 pages because that would be maybe a little painful. So let me share my screen and we'll jump right into the article. It's titled Money, Commodities, and Bretton Woods 3. So he starts with the current environment is perhaps more complex than the crisis of 1997, 2008, or 2020. For the problem is not only nominal, but also real. Commodities are real resources, food, energy, metals, and resource inequality cannot be addressed by QE, right? So he makes this distinction between nominal and real. And so all he means by that is nominal has been the state that we've been operating under for a long, long time, where central banks solve crises by adjusting interest rates or by quantitative easing or quantitative tightening, right? They have these levers they can work with within the central banks around the globe to be able to solve crises. However, now we are in a state where we have this real commodity crisis that the central banks aren't going to be able to solve because they have no levers to print more commodities, right? They can't address these commodity crises by QE. Okay, so that's the distinction Zoltan's making here. As we go through this article, one of the things I want us to be thinking about is what does this do as we go through and explore these different things that he talks about? What does this mean for our freedoms and also our quality of life, right? He's going to talk about inflation, right? What does that mean for our standard of living and potentially living with less or living with lower quality type items? What does this mean for housing, right? Housing affordability, housing inequality. What does this potentially mean for prescription drugs, right? It's not just oil or wheat that is coming, or semiconductors that is coming from different countries, right? We all know pharmaceuticals is a big piece of what we buy from China, right? So what does that mean for us in terms of our quality of life and our freedoms to be able to have these things? What does it mean for, even for our retirement accounts, right? If we thought $1 million in the past was enough to be able to retire on, we might be entering into a new space here where we might need to rethink that strategy or rethink how that investment is made. So he says, if we are right, inflation will be higher. The level of rates will be higher too. Demand for commodity reserves will be higher, which will naturally replace demand for FX reserves. And so what he means there is FX reserves being like treasuries, G7 currency, being the US dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen, things like that. So that's all he means by, commodity reserves will be higher, which will naturally replace demand for those FX reserves, right? Demand for dollars will be lower too, as more trade will be done in other currencies. We need to be thinking about what this means for our freedom and our quality of life going forward. So he brings up the notion here of inflation for commodities. And so as we enter into this deglobalization process, right, where countries are starting more and more to demand payment for their commodities in a certain currency, we see it happening with the ruble. We see it happening with the renminbi, right? What does that mean for us going forward, right? If there's less demand for the US dollar, intrinsically, the dollar is going to become less valuable. Okay, because there's less demand, right? It's a spiraling effect, right? If these countries are not accepting US dollars, what does this country do in terms of the supply that we have here in this country? If we're not able to replenish that quickly, then the supply of what we have will just intrinsically become more valuable, and inflation will set the price at whatever the market is going to pay. for that commodity until we here in this country figure out how we navigate this new world order. And this deglobalization that's going on. This is not a surprise for the East, right? It definitely is for the West. I think, based on what I've seen and read, but definitely for the East. Russia and China have been building their gold stockpiles since 2008. Since then, if not before then, on this potential currency, world reserve currency change, right? And this commodity change, right? They've been eliminating U.S. treasuries from their balance sheets. They've been preparing for this for a long time. He goes on to say, central banks have it easy when it comes to policing the price of money in the nominal domain, but when it comes to policing prices in the real domain of commodities, especially when pressures come not from demand but supply, or rather a supply shock caused by a collapse in demand for specific commodities, like Russian commodities, right? The market will self-police for fear of future sanctions, right? So, we see this happening today with Russia. There's obviously a need in other countries for Russian oil. And so Russia is demanding payment for that oil, that Russian oil, in terms of rubles, right? So we see that happening today, right? And we also see it happening with China and Saudi Arabia, where China is saying, sure, I'll buy your Saudi Arabian oil, but I'm going to pay with Chinese yuan, right? Not the US dollar. You can kind of look forward from there and kind of see, how the US dollar may become less valuable. There might be a less of a demand for the US dollar because, you just kind of let your mind wander and say, okay, in Egypt, right, they control what passes through the Suez Canal. So if Egypt is allowing tankers of oil to pass through the Suez Canal that have been paid for with Chinese yuan, what does the US dollar do to protect the petrodollar? Does the U.S. step in and sanction Egypt because Egypt is allowing oil to flow through that's been paid for with Chinese yuan? Who knows, right? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But that's a potential scenario that could happen, right? For the U.S. to protect the petrodollar system. We've seen things with, I've reported on with Canada, where the United States has doubled the lumber tariffs with Canada. Canada can say, okay, fine, U.S., we're not going to sell you lumber anymore. We're going to take our commodity and go sell it to somebody else. Or if you do want to buy it from us, we're going to demand payment in terms of yuan, not US dollars, right? They could do that, right? As we become more and more deglobalized as a world, these things can start to take place, right? So we all need to take a look at it again in terms of our freedoms, our quality of life, where we invest our money, right? Is now a time where we need to be more heavily invested in commodities or commodity-based assets, right? Like I say, like real estate, right? Because real estate is nothing more than a basket of all those different commodities, right? You need copper, you need steel, you need wood, you need all these different commodities. So maybe real estate is a good asset to hold going forward here to weather the storm. Maybe it's crypto, right? If you haven't researched crypto or gotten into it, maybe now crypto is a safer asset to hold going forward. One of the things I tried to do is bring this down to, to a point where folks who say, well, Tony, I don't have I don't have enough for to invest in real estate or to buy stocks or bonds or something like that, right? If you work in a gig economy, right, where you potentially you're writing articles or you're doing research or you're a virtual assistant for somebody, say you're working for somebody in Europe, you could demand payment in terms of euros, right? You don't have to actually take US dollars, right? So these are all different things that you can investigate and kind of work out for yourself how you want to take payment for your time in a gig economy. Commodity traders can deliver foreign cargo from port A to port B most of the time, but when not, the state intervenes, not the monetary arm, right? Not the central bankers, but the military arm of the state. The military branch is to the protection of shipments. Foreign cargo needs to sail on sea routes and through choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. And par in this context means being able to sail from here to there freely, safely, and without undue delays, right? So again, here we are in a new environment where commodities are almost seen as the new currency, right? And so getting them from port A to port B is incredibly important. And what if you don't have those trade routes, right? Some would say, you know, well, don't worry, Tony, we'll just build more stuff here in the United States. And to some degree, that's true. But, you know, I look at things like, you know, there's a big push here with making semiconductors in the United States. And maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. Time will tell. But this push to manufacture semiconductors in the United States, and there's companies building mega facilities to go ahead and do that. But the raw materials are not coming from the United States, right? I took a look at it, and the base materials, silicon, germanium, and gallium arsenide are all produced within China, right? At huge amounts. Silicon, for example, they produce 7 million metric tons of silicon compared to United States only produces 320,000. That's a huge difference between what China produces for silicon and what the US can produce. Germanium, 60% of the world's supply of germanium comes from China. 95% of the gallium arsenide comes from China. So we can build these semiconductor plants here in the United States, and that may be fine and well, but getting the raw materials to feed those lines to make the wafers, you know, you still need to have good trade routes and safe trade routes to get those raw materials from point A to point B. All right, let's continue on. And so we spoke about this one. Russia is now invoicing its commodity exports to non-friendly nations in ruble, right? Not US dollars or euros, right? Saudi Arabia is open to China paying for oil in renminbi, or the yuan, right? There's a slight distinction between the renminbi and what the yuan is. It used to be as simple as our currency, your problem, right? Now it's our commodity, your problem, okay? And like we already mentioned, again, we, the United States, or the central bankers, we can't QE oil, right? And he's equating QE of oil as to reserves, bank reserves, right? Or this is VLCC, very large crude containers. So these are ships, very large crude containers. He's equating it to the balance sheet, right? So this is the nominal state where the central banks can create reserves as part of the QE process, or they can expand the balance sheet in the nominal state. They can't do that in the real state. You can't just, you know, create a VLCC, right? A very large cargo container, crude carrier, and you can't just QE oil into existence. So he makes that distinction a few times here. So in this next section here, he makes the statement, sovereign states, right? So these independent states sometimes cooperate and sometimes they do not, right? Sovereign states have no enemies during globalization, right? We all work well together, but they turn into enemies during periods of deglobalization. China has been working on the Belt and Road Initiative since 2013. Again, I believe they've seen this coming, right? They've been working to put new trade routes in place to get commodities from port A to port B, okay? Safe trade routes, either over land or by sea. So they've been working that since 2013 to get Chinese commodities into European countries, okay? So I think the US is behind the curve when it comes to deglobalization. I want us to take a look back at, you know, what did we just witness here during the pandemic, right? Where we had, you know, limited supply of goods, right? You walk into the grocery store and it was one per customer could only be purchased, right? Or, you know, you can't come into a store without a face mask, or you can't come to this restaurant unless you're vaccinated, right? That was a very tough situation for us all to work through here. And the scars with that are still very fresh. But that is going to look like child's play in terms of not being able to get food or energy into this country. That is something I think we need to be able to think about, work through in our own minds, and find ways to protect ourselves going forward, right? So just to be able to give that contrast, yeah, it stinks walking into a store and needing to put on a face mask to go and buy my food for the week. But if that food isn't even on the shelf, wearing a face mask, that's the least of my problems, right? So I just wanted to offer up that perspective when it comes to deglobalization and enemies being created and who's willing to sell us their goods and who's not. That becomes a real big problem going on. And just to further stress that point on the food, Zoltan writes here, according to estimates by the United States Department of Agriculture, China holds half the world's wheat reserves and 70% of the corn reserves, right? In contrast, the US controls only 6% and 12% of the global wheat and corn reserves. So US has 6% of wheat and 12% of corn reserves, right? So not good for the US, right? If China controls the wheat reserves and the corn reserves. That has implications for the price level of food and the conversation about very large crude containers and the oil trade for the price level of energy. Experience during the pandemic was very difficult, and I don't think anybody would dispute that. It very much changed our quality of life and our way of living. Going forward, it could be, if we can't get food and energy in the quantities and the quality that we need here in this country, and for the prices we need to pay, that is going to be a very difficult situation for Americans going forward here. Okay, so he goes on to say Bretton Woods 3 will serve up an inflationary impulse, deglobalization, autarky, which is basically self-sufficiency, just in case hoarding of commodities will happen and duplication of supply chains will happen. But again, how long will that duplication of supply chains take? I think it's going to take some time to actually get that in place. And more military spending will be needed to be able to protect whatever seaborne trade is left. So again, this isn't just food, it's semiconductors, it's pharmaceuticals, right? It's down to the piece parts we need for pieces and parts for our automobiles, right? For the truckers who are carrying food and other commodities across interstates, right? When you have a demand that is high, like we have here in this country, because we are a consumption society, right? If you have demand that is high and supply that is low, we are going to be in this continuous state of inflation. Zoltan goes on with a couple of great charts. I'm not going to go into detail here too much with them, but he gives this one today where we have, or what we've been experiencing up until today of stable prices that are balanced on a financial stability and geopolitical stability, right? But then he talks about how we've moved to this geopolitical instability model where we have, geopolitical instability and financial instability, right? Because now we have folks demanding the purchase of a commodity be made in terms of a certain currency, right? So he's introducing this model here called Bretton Woods 3, where we now have financial stability and pricing stability only when we have almost like a two system or a two reserve currency status here. We have the transitioning of the US treasuries, the US dollar, to now, Chinese bonds, right? Or Chinese treasuries, let's call them, and the renminbi, right? So just a very interesting way that he ends this article on. So, all right. So hopefully that helped. This is a very difficult article to get through, 11 pages, a lot of technical data he puts in there, a lot of phraseology that he uses, and hopefully I did a good enough job to get through it and help you understand what it was all about. So thank you for sticking with me. And if it was helpful, great. Give us a like below. We'll do more of these if we get enough likes on them to be able to describe what's happening in the system out there today. All right. Thank you.